Okay, welcome. Let's get into it. So today I've got Nick Janes here with me, and we're gonna do a little collaboration where we talk about what are the conditions and the boundaries for what makes a problem in an SMB, small medium sized business, a good candidate to be put into Notion and to like build into Notion because not everything belongs in there. And this. So welcome, Nick. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Um, this video is a follow up, or it's following right after uh, a session I did where I took several like negative pieces of content about Notion. There's kind of like a bit of a flurry of that going on that I'm seeing come across my feed, and I wanted to understand where those people were coming from and like consume all of that, distill it into a core set of arguments, and then run those arguments past the experiences that I've been having with my SMBs. So I'd love to share that with you at some point. Oh, you got a nice friend behind you there.
Furry friend.
Um, who's that?
His name is John Paul.
John Paul. Anyway, would love to talk with you about that someday and kind of get your take on that. But this session is like, okay, because my conclusion from that was essentially that with the proper governance and the right kind of care, Notion can be very valuable for SMBs. Okay, great. So if that's true, what are the conditions in which you would make a decision to put something into Notion or not, right? So that's kind of the follow up of what we're doing today. And before we get into that specific part, I wanted to just get to know you a little bit, Nick, and what you're doing in your business. So tell us what you're up to, and tell me about iGeekuPlay.
Been running iGeekuPlay for a while. It was essentially a side hustle for me while I was working a normal 9 to 5. And I'll go into my kind of experience. So I was in big corporate world, working in data center, studied network engineering in university, and turned that into a job. And then slowly realized there's got to be better ways to do things. Learned Python, became a software developer, and then kind of graduated through the ranks. And then when I left the day job to do this full time, I was a software team lead, so I have a very developer friendly background, which leads me into kind of what iGeekuPlay is today. It has had many faces and phases and different service offerings. But essentially today, what I'm doing is I'm consulting obviously around Notion, but specifically like auditing tech stacks, looking at operational process and automation opportunities for small medium businesses, startups, solopreneurs, things like that. So really looking at what is the operational process or lack thereof, and helping them figure out what is the best tool or set of tools, how do they integrate, why is one better than the other, which really leads into the conversation we're having today about why is Notion good or bad for a specific small medium business, and just kind of help them through that process, be it automation, personal productivity within kind of the ecosystem, or the actual like tech and ecosystem itself.
What is your ideal client size, stage of client? You mentioned a few in there, but is there a too small or too big? Like, what's your wheelhouse, kind of down the middle of the fairway client size you like to work with and stage?
Yeah, so I think, obviously there's different levels. You can talk to someone that's starting a company and they're very far along in the journey and have a bunch of process and have a bunch of complexities around the business. You can talk to a solopreneur as well that, is just starting and doesn't really have that process and know what they need. So there's different levels of kind of headcount or size. But it's the smaller to mid-size, I would say, businesses, not a huge headcount. I am solo, so I don't have a team with me. But I do there are differences working with someone that's in the startup phase, regardless of headcount, versus someone that has been doing something the same way for years and years and years, because of the processes that are different, and they've kind of determined what works, what doesn't work. Versus the startup, it's kind of just go 1,000 miles a minute, become profitable, and then kind of figure it out. So part of my kind of skill set is helping those startup founders essentially that are going 1,000 miles a minute really figure out like what is the best tool to kind of organize and go down that route. Whereas taking a step back and working with a team, the more mid-sized small businesses, looking at their process and saying like, okay, you have all of these different systems, how do they integrate? So to kind of answer the question, it's probably on the smaller scale of business size. I would say probably like under 100 employees or under 100 headcount, definitely gearing more towards a medium, of 2 to 15 employees.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm right there with you. When I answer this question, I typically say like kind of 5 million in revenue to 50 million in revenue, or um, 10 employees to 200 employees. I have a client right now that's 150 employees, and when I started with them, they were under 100, so they've almost doubled. They're on trajectory to double, and it starts to get a little tricky to continue to manage that cultural adoption of, say, a custom Notion workspace when you get bigger and bigger and bigger.
Yeah. Yeah. And you get to a certain size, and then you have like companies within companies, right? Like the engineering department
Yeah,
becomes a company, and, HR
yeah,
becomes a company, and then there's different protocols and processes within them. And those are different problems to solve, and important problems to solve when you're looking and working with a business, especially in a tool like Notion that can be versatile to accompany all of those different issues. But it does get to a point where it gets too large that there isn't that pollination across departments, and you really are looking at like a siloed company essentially. So
so you've been solo consulting for how long now?
2 years now.
What has surprised you about it? What's good about it? What's hard about it?
Yeah, I mean, I was in the tech world before, so I was always hybrid, going into the office and being able to work from home and whatnot. But I think the biggest plus for me is just flexibility, starting a family, so getting to spend more time with the little one is definitely a big pro for me. And but I think getting back to just the business is you can choose what you want and what you don't want to work on. There is a point where in starting a business, where it's kind of feast and famine. So you take everything you can get, but hopefully you can get to the point where you can start to say no. A lot of people are afraid of that and think that's maybe a negative thing. But for me, it means that you've kind of provided uh, or shown your worth, so you can attract the right type of client that you want to work with, rather than having to take on projects that you might not necessarily want to do. So that's kind of been like the big thing for me, because I personally love projects where I can kind of get in the details, get dirty with the client, and figure out like, okay, what is their perspective? How are you seeing this issue that you're coming to me to solve? And really spend the time to go through it and understand why they think the way they think, or what emotional attachment they have to the process, things like that, versus just building out a solution and shipping it essentially. So that type of client and those types of projects is really what I kind of gear towards. And so being able to kind of say no to other projects and really focus on helping those people, and build those effective solutions for them is a really big pro for being solo.
Yeah. Um, okay. Last kind of warm up question on a personal front. Imagine you're having coffee with somebody who's thinking about getting into our specific line of work, yours. What advice would you give them?
Yeah, I think it's don't focus on the tech, as much as I am wanting to nerd out and geek out on different technology and features. And a new feature comes out, I'm always the first one to go and like play with it and kind of get an opinion on it. But I think it's very important to look at the processes and all the other things around business. I think that's something that I've also realized that has been difficult with being solo is you wear so many different hats. You have to be sales, you have to be marketing, you have to be, operational, you have to be HR, you have to be finance. And so you start to learn, these different roles and these different hats, which then applies to kind of that small medium business world where you can then go talk to these employees that you're kind of going through these issues that they've gone through. So I think the big thing is people want to say like I'm a Notion consultant or I'm a fill in the blank SaaS tool consultant, but don't focus on the technology. The technology could go away tomorrow. It could change and not service your industry or your target client. So what you really need to do is focus on the experience that you can pull from or getting the experience in working with an ideal type of client and going through those situations, because that's what's going to set you apart from others is your experience based off of the experience that you have outside of just the technical aspect of the tool. That's going to help you win or have successful projects because you're going to be able to pull in from that experience and convey those lessons learned to your clients.
Yeah, that's good advice. One of the things I was going to say a moment ago about like what I really enjoy about consulting, um, when you work full time at a business, um, there's just a certain amount of drag that happens in your day, a certain amount of like meeting overhead that
Yeah.
just like settles down on top of you, and when you I think part of the power of consulting is that you don't have that drag on you, so you can move faster. It kind of reminds me of like when an astronaut is on the moon and like makes one hop with their leg, they just kind of like bounce across like low gravity. I feel like consultants operate in a low gravity zone around a business and therefore can move fast, move dirt fast, and don't get kind of mired down in that productivity drag of being inside.
Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. Well, let's pivot over to the main part of the conversation, which is if you or I are working, for an SMB client, what decision making framework are we using to evaluate whether a particular business problem makes sense to solve in Notion? And I think this would also be useful just to a COO in a small medium sized business. So here in just a second, I'm going to share my screen and we're going to build together a Venn diagram of the overlapping conditions that say like, yep, this is a green light. Let's build this thing in Notion. And let's do that. Okay, so I'll start off with the ideas I put in there. Just for a little background context, I've been building Notion solutions in SMBs for 5 years, and my entry into it was very accidental. Like when I became a consultant, I wasn't planning to do it. I just ended up having some time while I was looking for my next full-time job, and certain projects came available, and I was like, oh, this is really good. But I'll tell you that my two big concerns when I contemplated like not looking for a full-time job but actually being a consultant, my two big concerns were I did not want to show up with a formulaic answer and try to like project that onto the client, right? That's a very stereotypical objection about consultants, is that like, oh, they've been doing the same thing for 20 years and they know what their formula is, and so they're just going to like foist that onto you. And the second thing that I was concerned about was um, I didn't like the fleeting utility of advice. Like if I come in with a particular business experience, and so I can observe your problem and I can say like, hey, based on your team, based on your strategic objectives, here's the course I recommend. Um, that's fine, and that might sound smart and valuable in the moment, but if you can't operationalize it, like that's why people get frustrated with. Yeah, that's one of the reasons why people get frustrated with consultants. And in my very first engagement, the CEO said to me, hey, we just got this thing called Notion. I had never heard of it before, and so he said you might want to play around with it and consider delivering your deliverable to us through it. And what I was building at the time was like like a sales ops scaffolding around Salesforce. So in Salesforce, they had their CRM kind of, you know, pipeline laid out and everything, but there's an entire narrative around like how do we define a lead? What are the objections? Like that whole body of knowledge that like, you'd want to train a sales team through. And so I ended up building that out as a essentially like a database workflow in Notion. So that was pretty great, right? Like that was better than giving them a PowerPoint, and it was highly customized to their thing. And so it really checked some boxes for me personally of, yeah, I don't want to be the stereotypical consultant. And that was my first introduction to Notion. And of course, like conversely, they loved it. They were just like, this is amazing. Like you built this software. So it was kind of like this magic moment for me. Um, and so for the last 5 years, I've just been going deeper and deeper into different kinds of businesses and experimenting with how much of this works. Like how much does it make sense to do? So I laid out here some things that were top of mind for me. Let's talk through them. And then at any point in here, just like jump in if you have a story or if you agree or disagree. So I broke this into business factors and technical factors. And under the business factors, to me, the very first thing is if you do not have a champion that's willing to partner with you to unpack the true cross-functional alignment that you're trying to, define and make happen, I cannot build a solution for somebody in a vacuum, right? There's no amount of Notion skill that can actually provide value in the absence of a company knowing how they want to do business. And so when I first started, like when I got pretty excited about the value opportunity here with Notion and consulting, I started like running ahead of my clients and just being like, well, surely they're going to want this. And so build, 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 build. And then I would try to backfill with the champion. That's the wrong way to do it. I discovered that was the wrong way to do it. And I put the word decider next to champion here because by champion, I don't just mean that they are kind of culturally bought into the idea. I mean that they have enough inside knowledge and authority to make decisions about policies, like what language do we use, through that operational workflow. What do we prioritize? How does this connect to the company's mission? How does this connect to strategic objectives? And so you really need an authoritative and educated partner to build a really good solution.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree with that. I think there's two kind of ways that people can be champions as well is as you get into kind of the larger side of the businesses, typically in the past, I've looked for like who is the Notion champion and who's going to take on like the technical debt of the tool, because that person's not always the decider of how things work with the process. Whereas different departments, different leaders within those organizations maybe are the champion or the decider of what the process looks like and why things should be the way that they are. So that's something else that I've kind of looked for is like who is the technical person, just because for me, a lot of the time it's, obviously as a consultant, the more that you're on the payroll and that you're in theory, the more dependent they are on you, and it should be better because, it's a longer contract, you're getting paid, maintenance hours, things like that. But I found that to kind of like flip and cause the project to not be as successful versus giving people the authority and like the technical skill set, teach someone to fish instead of giving them a fish kind of mentality. So that way they can be self-sufficient, which is why I use, no code tools, because they can learn them without having to have software, development knowledge. And so that's been something that I think has helped a lot, is kind of those two people might be the same person, but it's kind of like just two different roles or two different personas per se.
Yeah. Okay. So you use the phrase tech debt. I just want to make sure that I'm understanding because I think I know what you mean. And I've noticed this myself in deals. It because the Notion solution is the least amount of software necessary to express like the true kind of uniqueness and differentiation of like whatever that cross-functional workflow is or whatever, it will inevitably change. The policies will change, people will come and go. And so as that drifts away from the original build, by tech debt, do you mean the refinement and maintenance of the database and the values and the workflow in connection to the reality of how it's drifted?
Yeah, right. There's a process on paper that can be abstracted with a workflow, but then there's specifics of those, right? Is it a database view? Is it a property? And so the tech debt there is kind of two things. So from a um, Notion specific champion, as new features come out, it's changing views and adding capabilities as the workflow changes or as the tool itself changes to allow the workflow to be more black and white, I think, like within the tool itself, right? So I always like have this quote that I've, probably requoted 1,000 different ways, but it's always let the tool shape, or don't let the tool shape your process, let the process shape the tool, which is why I like Notion, because it's essentially an empty box. And you can design the box the way that you want to fit your process. Whereas you go to a lot of other SaaS tools and it's like, you can only do it this way. It's not these building blocks that you can put together to build a new process. So when you take a process and you are basically building out that workflow within Notion, there are capabilities within Notion that somebody needs to understand. Like, okay, I can add a button, I can add an automation, I can do these things. But then there's also another person that says, this is the way that the process works, regardless of a tool. So you kind of have to balance those two things. And that's the technical debt, which is some of it is maintenance, but some of it is as new technical capabilities arise, what are the possibilities, right?
Yep, that's great. Okay, nice addition there. All right, so we'll call this maintenance plus new features. We can work on the wording later. I want to flip over real quick before we get too far away on this kind of champion decider. One of my clients is doing a great job of kind of the cultural buy-in and making it transparent who owns what. So I just want to show a quick example of that. So here is the HR page of a particular company, and they've got all sorts of stuff in here: benefits, recruiting, performance management, etc. But at the bottom here, they've got their chief people officer. And the way we refer to this is like, it's like the adopt a highway signs, like the next 2 miles are owned by this company. So Samantha here, if anybody has a question about this page, can just reach out to Samantha and she's accountable to it. So that's a nice way to do that.
Is that a like strategy that you're deploying on specific pages, or is it like?
Yeah, just like big mission critical workflows. Yeah.
Gotcha.
Yeah. It would be too much to do it all over the place, but is that why you were asking? Because what isn't scalable to 500 pages?
I mean, as an API person, you can make it scalable. So like to make the story short, I did a large scale migration and we wanted to have a reference to the original page, which was in a different tool. So I basically built a call out block API, set of API calls or block payloads that would basically say, if you are looking for the original document, click this link, and then you just insert the link. So we did that on every single page, and it was a large corporate migration from Atlassian Suite to Notion. And so we did that, but
so could that call out go to something like Bamboo HR and grab a picture of
yeah, it's
somebody?
just an external link, right? So you just hyperlink to whatever. In that case, it was a one-to-one thing, right? Because you had an original page and a new page, so you always had a match. We were using IDs to match things up, but yeah, Notion automations native aren't there today, but the call out links with the automations in theory would be really cool. Where today, if you had, let's say, a database of SOPs or documentation, based off of some other property like an owner or something, you could put like a call out block automatically at the bottom. Templates kind of come in there, but templates aren't really working well with native automations today. But that would be a cool kind of use case to have that block get reproduced based off of a set of kind of
Yeah,
automation
yeah,
filters.
yeah. No, that's a cool idea. Um, okay, so we got champion, we've got sort of maintainer. The third business requirement or highly recommended business condition is that the thing is strategically relevant. And I know that sounds kind of like a throwaway comment, like, well, duh, of course it should be strategically relevant. But I mean it in a specific way. I am noticing in my workflow deployments in SMBs that there is a through line. If the problem is strategically material and relevant enough, then from the database to the, let's say, workflows, there is an extra kind of pull through up to like board metrics, KPIs that naturally fall out of those operating metadata. So I'll give you an example. One of my clients has very high ACV, annual contract values, for their B2B clients, so like 7 figures per contract at minimum. And so when a project manager says our go live date, like our original go live date is going to be May 1st, but then it slips 5 times and the actual go live date is September 1st, well, that's 4 months in which that amount of revenue wasn't recognized. That's a huge deal. But from a project manager standpoint, they may not see that, right? They're just like, well, the customer went on vacation and then someone got pregnant and then we were delayed for one release or whatever, right? So um, we built a date slippage tracker in, like, we embedded, like, built a custom date slippage tracker into the projects and task template of Notion. And so now we've got quantitative data about, by project manager, how many, like on average, how many times does this project manager's dates slip versus this one? And for each one that slipped, why did it slip, right? We've got like a drop down list for the reasons, like the customer caused it or we caused it or whatever. So now that the COO and the board have gotten used to seeing these KPI metrics, that might be redundant, these KPI numbers, whatever, that tell this story. Now the use of that Notion solution is it's required,
Yep.
right? And so instead of just kind of building something that looks cool and solves a particular problem, if we can connect it to something that's going to show up into a board meeting, then we've kind of got a built-in insurance policy that it's going to kind of keep a life of its own.
Yep. Yeah, I think that goes back to the kind of first thing we were talking about as well, right? Is like when you're going through that journey of that development process and thinking of like, what is the process today? Maybe the process changes before a solution's built. Sometimes you build solutions that inform new process, or sometimes vice versa. When you know that there's a process, like going into that situation, hey, there's these KPIs that we need and we are missing them today. Let's build a solution to kind of fix that. But very much so, it happens the other way, where you're kind of going through the building out this solution, and then you start to kind of identify and have to go back and change some fundamental things, because you start realizing, hey, now that we have X, Y, and Z, we can get this other insight. And sometimes that kind of informs process, because before, when you're using a tool and that's kind of defined your process, you're looking at it with a specific view. But if the new view, you essentially are taking a step back so you can see more of the picture and the kind of systems design thinking, then new things reveal themselves of, hey, now we can create this KPI, or we can create this dashboard, or we can create this view that X person or a C-level exec can go look at. and then you create dependencies, and then that turns into how can we do this for this other thing, and creates more work, which is where the tech debt and refinement comes in.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think you just hit on one of the magic value unlockers of Notion is that we SMBs and we have become so habituated to grabbing the next point SaaS solution to solve our business problem, of course, which each point SaaS solution has its contained data and database, um, that we've almost lost sight of how powerful it is when we centralize all that data. And so
Yep.
unexpected business intelligence becomes available to you by connecting two or three or four data sources that previously were siloed in different tools. So yeah,
Yeah, and it's not just data like warehouse type of thing where it's just all the data is kind of getting like pushed into one place, right? It's data that's being manipulated and stretched and used and processed all within the tool, in this case, Notion. So it's not just like, go dump a bunch of data and it's formatted incorrectly and it's not usable. This is stuff that's being used every single day, where it sits essentially. So
right, right. It's living, it's refreshed, it's expressing the actual work that's being done in real time. Yeah, totally agree. Okay, the last business factor I had is that there needs to be high paying and or tolerable switching cost. So if the problem we're talking about has like a deep tech entrenchment with another tool, and the pain's not high enough, then you're essentially not going to get your champion. Um, so I feel like A and D kind of go together because a smart champion should say no to something that's not high pain or it's too expensive to switch off of. Um, but every now and then I'll come across uh, a friction heavy problem that I'm just like chomping at the bit to solve for, but they've got such a deep tech stack investment in it, even though it's not working well, that to like crowbar that out is just a little bit too much. So everything else seems to hit, but it's like, well, they just rolled out Microsoft Teams. It's this massive rollout and they're entrenched. So,
mm-hmm.
yeah.
Yeah, I what jumped to mind when you said that is like looking at different industries with tech fleeting and migrations and like upgrades is typically, in the tech industry, for me coming from enterprise, the corporate world, you would migrate to the latest thing, whether it was a different vendor or latest version or whatever. And then basically once that project is done and you've completed all the work, there's another version available or there's a new tool available. And that's kind of like, hey, there's a better way to do it. Let's do like the pain's high, right? Let's do the migration. Let's do that. Compared to other industries, maybe like healthcare or banking, where their mentality is like, it works. The pain's not high
Yeah.
enough. It works. So we're going to stay here until they're forced to have to upgrade or have to move. And you see that, industry aside, you see that with different businesses. And some of that's driven by the people, maybe the industry as well, how long the business has been around, and maybe processes and things like that as well. Is where's that pain tolerance? And, what is the culture? Is it to kind of not fix what's not broken? Or is it to kind of like, what's the new shiny object and like get there? And I think that's something that from a business and also technical factor, working with multiple people, but just, the nature of different businesses, something you have to be aware of as well is if they have that kind of shiny object syndrome, or they're, very low pain tolerant, or I guess high pain tolerance to change things, because that really does make a big difference in how you approach providing solutions or, kind of navigating what the pain points are to build solutions off of.
Yeah. And this one is a bit of a self-fulfilling standard, because if you can't get someone to book time with you to meet and talk about the topic, then the pain's not big enough, because it always costs something to go define that thing and unpack it. So
Yep.
Um, can you think of any other business related factors before we move to technical that we should consider here?
I don't think right off the top of my head, there's nothing really. I think a good kind of platform between business and technical is there's a lot of like capability stuff, or maybe not capabilities is maybe the wrong word, but um, like security and legal typically is like a gray area between business and technical, because for technical reasons they're can't share data and things like that, where or maybe it's a business thing because of the nature of their business. If they're in healthcare or whatever, obviously they can't share medical records and things like that, but you also need that data to kind of inform the technical side of things, whether it's data being stored in a database or whatever. So that it's kind of like this gray area of compliance, I guess is maybe the better word, of like the business compliance versus the technical compliance, which is something
Right.
that is hard to deal with. And to be honest, I've kind of steered away from, just because it's a very hard, you have to choose, right? You kind of have to choose capabilities, or you have to choose not necessarily non-compliancy, but there's definitely trade-offs there, and it's a hard thing to kind of guide business owners or decision makers through.
So what comes to mind when you say that is I was talking to a doctor who owns a private, like a general practitioner private practice here in Dripping Springs outside of Austin, and it's got like 24/7 emergency care and general practitioner, kind of your normal like non-hospital doctor office. And in our recent my recent visit with him, he said he's starting a new concierge medical business, like no insurance. You pay $10,000 a month, and this guy's like your like private doctor or whatever you need kind of thing. And so he was talking to me about building potentially a Scratch OS custom Notion workspace for him. And I think what you're talking about with that intersection between security compliance and legal is where my concern was for this guy. It's like HIPAA, like there, if we think about the patient data and the patient workflows, I'm probably not going to put any of those in Notion. But if it's just an internal operation thing, probably, maybe we'll have to see. But I did not jump on that opportunity because I was realizing like, oh, that's going to be that healthcare security and privacy requirement is going to be a big drag on what Notion can do for them. Is that kind of what you
Yeah.
mean?
Yeah, because there's tools that maybe are better suited with the HIPAA compliancy. Notion can be HIPAA compliant, going through various different toggles and settings and whatnot. Um, but that's where it's like, okay, the solution, like if you kind of forget about the compliancy and you designed a solution, or like went through that process to create a solution, there's a lot of maybe holes and gaps of things, or maybe even workarounds, right? So you can't use patient names. You can use random kind of unique IDs that you can then go to another tool and look up to like look at patient records, and that's compliant. Um, but then there's also a big difference, in the EU versus in the US as well, of like what is defined as like tracking somebody. So if there's an identifier that matches to another record in the EU, then that's considered like tracking, but in US it's not. So there's like that gray area, and I've spoken to a lot of people that were either in startups in the health industry, or even just like a doctor's office, like you had mentioned, and yeah, so there's a lot of complexities and kind of gray area that by no means am I a medical HIPAA lawyer, and know all of those laws and rules to be able to consult on that anyway. So I've kind of steered away from that as well, which kind of becomes a limitation between the business and the technical side.
Yeah. Okay. Let's move into the technical factors that I've definitely experienced. So the first one, well, yeah, the first one is if I'm going to build a solution for an SMB, the database, I have to think about how big that database is going to get. And so for one of my clients, we built a customer journey, customer success solution where they've got HubSpot for the obvious things that HubSpot does, sales and renewals, basically. But the lifetime journey of this customer with this particular business I work with, it's a 7+ year customer journey. So we've got super complex delivery, customer success, customer support, product enhancements, conference collaboration, social media posts. There's a whole universe of that customer's life outside of HubSpot. And we were able to build a really cool lifetime journey Notion solution that told that whole story, other than the portion that stayed in HubSpot. But that only works in a world like this particular client. They've got about 100 clients because they're large B2B, customer base, and maybe they're going to end up with 200 someday. But if this were a B2C situation and they needed to store 10,000 or 100,000 customers, I think, you tell me, like I couldn't do that, could I? Like I would get stopped at like just like cloud latency, wouldn't I?
It depends. I mean, there's a lot of um, depends on like the number of databases you're pulling in from, as well as like what the data is. If it's computed data, there's different ways to like manipulate views so that way, because the way that Notion's working is it's like rendering all the data like on load. So if there's a ton of records or there's a ton of relations to different databases, then it's trying to like essentially do like a deep search in a way of those related databases versus giving you like the bare minimum. And until the user takes action to click on something, then it renders that data. And part of that, I think, is also like offline mode and other things too. But yeah, I mean, it's hard to say. It kind of just depends because I've done some performance testing around like numbers of records, and there's theoretically some calculation formula that you could build on like if it's a text property versus a formula, if the formula contains four
Mm-hmm.
functions versus 10 functions.
Okay.
There's definitely like a recipe there that you can use to manipulate a little bit, which is like what I'm doing with menu engineering, right? Is like not taking 12 databases and trying to render a bunch of information in calculations, but instead trying to look at the process of like what's static and like what is the timeline when the data becomes static. That way you don't have to like render it every single time and do the computations.
Okay. So maybe I'm being too black and white and a little too simplistic about this. So if I said to you, I have a B2C client and they've got, they want to be able to do this lifecycle management, like I told you, for 50,000 customer records, you would not necessarily say like, yeah, you can't do that. It depends on the kind of data, the kind of functions. Is that what I'm hearing you say?
Yep. Yeah, and even just
Oh,
like how many databases are related to the customer, right? Because if it's 50,000 records of notes, right, and there's just another database of notes that's related to the client, that's pretty low hanging fruit,
okay.
like, but if there's notes and there's like interactions and like let's say it's calls and meetings and then meeting notes and tasks and like all of these different things, then you're talking about maybe 8, 9 different databases. So for every one, client or record in, the clients or consumer database, then you have 12 other things. Obviously, that's where it gets more complex, and that total number that you can support is going to come down a lot.
So how should I say this? Because this is too simplistic. So uh, quantity and complexity of database. Well, what would you? How would we frame this?
Um, yeah, I would say like data complexity, scalability, complexity and volume, scalability.
Yeah. And and so this is one of those things that, I mean, I'm definitely learning from you right here in the moment. That is not, there's no easy answer to it. It does depend. And
Yeah.
so, guess who I'm going to be calling the next time I have one of these questions.
And
Uh,
there's a lot of things
okay.
like that too, right? Like some people will say, I need this thing built. Can Notion do this? And the answer is always like, you could, and it would
Maybe.
be possible, maybe. But usually my response to that is why? Like, why do you want to build it in Notion? Right? Because I try to push back on that of like, what's the problem you're having and why is like you have some kind of solution that you think Notion can solve, but like what is that solution outside of the tool itself? And then if it's not like specific features that the tool has, then maybe there's another tool or maybe it should be designed in a different way. Um, so yeah, a lot of the times that's kind of the answer is like it depends, and it's because of things like this, or to kind of pivot into the next thing as well. Um, Data, right? Like how secure does the data need to be within your team? Is it a whitelist or blacklist model where you don't want anyone to be able to see anything and you're just going to provide permissions when you need? Or is it everyone can see everything and I just want to hide? Because both of those are solutions which both have their own pros and cons and complexities with them, but one's going to fit the model of the data or the company or whoever you're working with better.
Right. Okay. So, um, just to wrap up the last one, uh, that's kind of good news for me because I was ruling out a set of possible, solutions there. I would have like ruled out of hand, and I won't do that going forward. So that's great. Thank you for that. This second one that you were just making a reference to, um, here's how I understand this one. If if I give like we all know there's this Notion database security limit that you can't go more granular than, and it's a problem. Like it limits the number of use cases you can put into Notion. And the way I would say it is, if you give somebody view rights to a database, they get view rights or edit rights, whatever the rights are, to the entire database. And so if the database needs privacy inside of itself, like this user can see these records and this user can see some other records, but they shouldn't be able to see each other's records, that's a no-go situation for putting it into Notion. True?
True with an asterisk.
Okay.
Because technically you can do it, but there's no like automated programmable way to do it, right? You can't set up a rule to say if this person is in this property, they should have access to today's point date. The API also can't change page permissions or database item permissions. That could have been a workaround, but neither of those things are available today. But you can manually do it. If you're talking about tasks and it's something you're going to be creating hundreds or thousands of records, probably not. But if it's a notes database, for example, and you just want one note that's a recurring note to be private, like a one-on-one notes, you could always make that specific page in the database private. So that way only the people that have access to it would see it.
Right. So you're basically, so you're applying database permissions, but then inside of the database, one record, you're forking off the permissions for that one record.
Right. So
So
that's kind of what I alluded to. Sorry, maybe industry terminology. Whitelist versus blacklist is like security firewall terminology, right? So whitelist is by default allow everything. So I'm going to give Myers permissions to view this database. That's whitelist model. And I'm going to go in and I'm going to specifically say Myers cannot see this one record. Whereas blacklist model would say, I'm not going to give Myers access to anything in the database or the database at all, but I'm going to give him access to this one specific page. And that would be the blacklist model. So by default, everything's kind of all your permissions are denied.
okay. And you can do that inside of Notion if you're willing to manually grant
Correct.
record by record
Correct.
access. So this So there's some scalability questions there, concerns there. Let me tell you a situation that I've got right now and see if, because I think I'm stuck on something and I'm not quite sure how to advise my client. So here's the situation. So annual strategic objectives, we've got a database for that roll down into corporate goals. So all these are public. They're all intended to be public. I've got strict permissions about who can edit them, but the purpose of these strategic objective databases and corporate goal databases that support a strategic objective, and then department goals that support a corporate goal, is to create this flow down uh, cultural transparency of what are we saying is important as a company and what are we working on as a company and as a department. So that's great. And this company's really embraced it. It looks great. Everybody can see what's going on. It's great. Now, naturally, they want to take departmental goals and go down a level and say, well, these are the individual goals or tasks that are supporting the departmental goals. And they have said, but it is a requirement that a manager should be able to comment or interact with one of their employees' individual goals with privacy. So are you saying that if we're willing to absorb the manual cost, which is not trivial, because it's 150 people with, let's say, 5 goals each, 4 times a quarter, so 20 goals, 20 individual goals a year at least times 150 people is, are you good at quick math? 3,000?
Yeah. Regardless,
3.
I mean, that's the numbers are variables, right? Because what happens if they scale and expand or, whatever. The thing that I would say the is the comments and interaction that needs to be kept private. Is that something that should be done at the task level, or is that going to be done at the goal level?
Well, and they don't even want, let me actually go up a level. They don't even want people to see each other's individual goals, because one of the individual goals could be acquire this company, or something where the goal is too sensitive for the entire company to see.
Right. So, yeah, I would say you'd have to do that manually where you would go in and say, like, this specific goal should be private, only this person has access to it, and this person has access to it. Whereas if it was something where, like, let's say you have tasks and all tasks are, more generic, and visibility is not an issue, but you want specific comments on that task to be private. In that case, I would say, why not create like a separate database that's related to the task that is essentially private? And then that's just a relation, but and that would maybe solve that problem. But yeah, I mean, if you want OKRs essentially, like, or whatever your goal is and your key result or your task or your action items, and you want some of them to be private, some of them to be public, you'd have to go in and manually set that up, basically.
Okay. Well, that's better than there being no solution. It's just
Yeah.
that's a decent amount
The
of
other,
manual work.
yeah, the other scenario where this has come up for me is like tasks, right? Is you have like your team tasks, but then people also have private tasks. Sometimes the private tasks are totally private, like walk the dog, and it has nothing to do with work, and they want it to be private. And sometimes it's a specific thing that they need to do, but they also want to be able to relate it to a project. And so the solution that I've used for that is on like the personal dashboards for each individual, they would have their own child essentially task database that would have a one-way relation to projects. So in that case, all of that database is private. And if they wanted to, have one task be able to be seen by their manager, or the whole database be able to be seen by their manager, or something in that like that, then obviously you could set that up at the database level. So that's another pretty common example.
Right. The one-way relationship, so that, yeah, that makes sense.
And that just, I mean, not that it would matter, because the way that the relationships work is if I don't have access to this other database, I'll see the property, but it'll just be empty. But it just keeps things clean, so you're not going to the projects database and you see 25 or 100 different properties called Nick's tasks, Myers tasks, Bob's tasks, Joe's
Right.
tasks, whatever, right?
Right. Right. Okay. That's great. So, so this is maybe again an oversimplified way of saying that. It's not that you can't have intra DB private data. It's that you have to be willing to apply a manual security solution to that, which, I mean, arguably, I'm just trying to think of like another tool. Like this company uses Lattice, Lattice. It's like a performance management tool. Um, and so they've thought like, oh, we should probably put our goals, our individual goals into Lattice, which then begs the question, well, should we keep our departmental and corporate goals and strategic objectives in Notion, right? Like you pull that thread and you might just keep pulling. Um, but if you, yeah, I guess the question is whether Lattice has built-in business logic to like automatically hide or keep secret goals between a manager and their direct reports. Like there's probably some more sophisticated UX to speed that up in a tool. And this is where SaaS tools do have an advantage over Notion.
Hmm. Yeah, there are some public hints of this being solved in Notion as well. So I think it's something that's being actively worked on, but when
Yeah.
that will be available, I have no idea. But there are some different demos and things that Notion's put out that definitely teases this idea.
Yep. I've
And it's
seen that.
probably like the number one requested feature besides offline mode.
Yeah. I mean, it definitely catapults Notion into a new level of business relevance by doing that for sure. Um, I'm pretty confident they'll get it done at some point. I've been impressed with the velocity of their change and roadmap progress.
Yeah, and I think it's
Oh,
even more important to figure out as they build on the suite with charts and forms and those features that they have launched recently.
yeah. Okay. Anything else you want to add to this decision framework for an SMB?
Um, I I was hesitant to say this just because I don't it depends like a lot of things. Um, Notion is a very like keyboard friendly, hands-on developer-ish tool as compared to a lot of other SaaS tools. So there's definitely a level, and it's not like a requirement, which is why I think I was hesitant to kind of bring it up. But I do think that there's like with keyboard shortcuts and like this concept of like databases and stuff, it really pulls to like this software development kind of side of things that there is definitely like a I'm not saying that you have to be super technical to in order to use Notion because you can kind of learn Notion, but at the end of the day, like if you have that background and you come into the tool, you're going to be a lot better off, or you're going to be at least quicker in the start. So I do think that from like a technical kind of factor, from a skill set factor, that is something that I've noticed a big difference with companies that are already struggling to use the computer as part of their process, and we're very paper on site, hands on oriented. To go to a digital tool, let alone Notion, has been a factor as well in determining like what should that process be or look like, and that usually informs design decisions and stuff as well.
Yeah, no, I think this is a totally valid point. It's almost like a technical water line. Like you and I show up to this tool and it's pretty intuitive to us, but I have definitely seen in like sales departments or finance teams, maybe less so finance because they get pretty geeked out with Excel and that helps a lot. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but yeah, if the user, if the subset of users that we're expecting to interact with this tool over time are intimidated by it, are not familiar with just don't have a certain level of confidence, then yeah, you might question whether it'll get adoption. I mean, yeah,
Mhm.
I think that's overcomable, but it kind of depends on how busy these people are, how open minded they're willing to be, and kind of what the executive mandate is or isn't. But yeah, it's definitely a factor.
Yeah. And I think you said like kind of sales. So that's another thing is depending on the position or the industry, like mobile friendliness is definitely something that is important. If people are in the field doing like field work or, salespeople essentially, if they're like visiting and doing a lot of stuff, quote unquote, in the field, you can design for mobile responsiveness. But at the end of the day, when you're looking at like a client profile and it's just a table of data, that makes it much harder to view from a mobile standpoint. Whereas if you're, doing a lot of text and it's like articles and things like that, that's a little bit easier to do mobile because you're not, scrolling and, trying to click and drag and open up, menus and things like that. So that's definitely something that comes into play.
Yeah, that's a good catch. One of my clients is a winery here in Texas, and they had a grounds and maintenance team, which was two guys driving around like 100-mile radius of these different physical properties in the Texas Hill Country. These are just different like winery or wine production centers that they were driving around to. And um, the CFO said like these guys, they'll drive to property A and go fix a light bulb or a leaky toilet or whatever. Leave property A, drive 45 miles to property B, and then realize that they've got Slack messages and emails saying, "Hey, we have more problems at property A." Right. So the efficiency of these two maintenance crews trying to navigate this geographic area with limited time, showing up with the right tools, concentrating the number of fixes they're doing when they get to a particular site. Like we built a really cool grounds and maintenance service desk for these guys. And and then as we rolled it out and they started living in it, they're in their truck on a small iPhone SE. And so that was a challenge. And it wasn't like we did get over it because I built them a essentially like a mobile dashboard, just a page that was like mobile friendly for their iPhones, where there was a checkbox to click task is done and that changed the status, and they didn't have to open up the record and go in. But it definitely took an extra level of care to understand their experience in the field in their trucks trying to manage all these things.
Yeah. I think there's a lot of design that can go into that as well, which it becomes more of process of using Notion itself. So for example, like in that use case, right? If the thing you're trying to solve is that they don't work on something and then like go to the next location and then like don't realize that there's more things to do. If you design something for them and it was just essentially like a bulleted list of things to do and there's no metadata or sorting or filtering on the location, they could look at the list and say, hey, I need to fix this toilet. I need to do this, this, and this. That's at this other property. I'm going to go head that way. But if you design something that wasn't a simple list and it was more of a, I'm going to property A, here's the list
Mm.
of things, check, 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 there's nothing left. Then I go to the next property. That's like a very small process design thing that could completely change their experience, right?
Yeah, which is definitely what we did. Each property kind of had its own grouping or dashboard. So yeah, it was good. Okay. I think we're getting to the end of the list that you and I can think of. Thanks. That was a good, nice ad there at the end. Anything else you want to say? So I put two questions at the bottom here for mathematical complexity and requiring state data. And I had actually a specific example in mind. And this is actually one that I want to scope with you for you to potentially work on. It's the same client that we're doing, with the other other scope we're working on. They want to calculate. So some of their KPIs that they're tracking can be calculated based on operational workflows and databases in Notion. And they want to save off a state of that KPI. But every one of the KPIs can be different. Like it's a percentage, it's a total, it's a greater than or a less than. And so there's some mathematical complexity, and there is, some form of state data. I think I'm saying that right. Like when you save off state, right, it's permanent from a point in time. I don't know
It's
how to
like
solve
it's
that.
time series data essentially.
Okay, cool. Thank you. That's a better way to say that. So is that achievable? That idea, that
Yeah.
you've got 10 or 15 different kinds of KPIs, each one has a different mathematical driver, and then saving a time series off. That sounds achievable to you?
Are all of the short answer is yes. Are all of the metrics in a single database, or are they across several databases?
They're across different databases.
And across those databases, do they all relate to one thing, like a client?
We're going to have to just look at it offline.
Okay.
I there
But yeah,
there's a KPI.
you can definitely do it. So regardless of the answer to those questions, if they're all in one database, it's obviously super simple, or I guess it's simpler. If they're not, then you need something that kind of spans like a database in relationships or relation properties that span across all those databases. So you can basically bring all the data into one database. So something I did with menu engineering, and a lot of other projects is you create this stats database, which is just a single item. And so if they wanted to do this like every week or every month or every quarter, it would be like a quarter database, and you'd have Q1, Q2, Q3, Q4. And essentially every single like item in all of the various different databases that you want to pull metrics from would be related to that single thing, right? Let's say call it stats. And that way you can use relations, and you could say like I want to go to this database, and even if the database is like 5 databases away, because database one's related to two, two to three, three to four, four to five, you can still pull that data all the way up to the top. And then in order to kind of save that as a state, whether it's a single database or multiple databases, you can create a button that has an automation that creates a record and just basically takes all the data, whether it's a percentage, a number, or whatever. If it has to do math, it can do math, but just move it into another database that saves with the state or saves with the time. So after you do that 25 times, now you have 25 records. You could chart it right on a line graph to say, show me the percentage value over the last 25 times, which let's say it's weeks, that would be half a year, right? So yes, it's definitely possible. Just kind of have to figure out the exact situation.
All right. Well, we have another scope then to figure out with this client, so stand by for that. Okay, so we're at an hour, little over an hour now. There was one more topic I wanted to bring up with you. This is about your ERD diagram. Do you have a couple minutes to chat about that? Potentially show it, or okay. So this whole conversation's focused on like, how do SMBs use Notion in a really healthy way? And one of the things I've noticed in my long engagements with an SMB is that we end up building a bunch of different solutions, and those solutions have a bunch of different databases underneath them. And I have tried to like make that transparent and manageable by, in every one of my team spaces, having a parent page called source databases. I found it like prohibitive, like a non-starter, to just put databases in random pages, in proximity to whatever the dashboard wanted to be. Like I started off doing that, and I was like, wait a sec, where are the databases? I don't even remember where I put those databases. Then it's hard to tell, am I looking at a linked view or am I looking at a database? I know you can tell, but like that just takes extra effort. So I eventually figured out that if I'm going to build a workspace for an SMB, like one of my workspace setup best practices is to embed a source databases page in every team space. That helps a lot. But you've built a ERD tool that crawls a database and then visualizes all of the related databases, so that you can actually get a database map. So if you want, feel free to share your screen and show it. And I would love, while you're doing that, just answer the question, what motivated you to build this? Like, what problem were you responding to? How's it going? And like, what's the ideal way you want people to use this tool?
So yeah, I built this tool called Notion ERD. ERD stands for Entity Relationship Diagram, which is, I guess a specific industry term in the world of databases. And kind of the reason that I built it, a little bit of a story. It was actually the opposite way that I wanted to build. So what the tool does is it takes basically Notion infrastructure and creates like code essentially, which can visualize a database. But I initially wanted to take a bunch of code and then be able to like deploy databases and deploy infrastructure within Notion. But it was obviously easier to do it the other way around because, people were able to visually go into Notion, and you're taking something that's highly complicated and detailed because there's views and, permissions and other things, and then be able to kind of dilute that or like concentrate that into just the diagram of the databases. So thus, I built this. Really, the thing that I'm trying to kind of target is being able to visualize databases. So whether you're a consultant and a freelancer, or an educator or a project manager, large organizations, consultants, we're constantly working with our clients to look at what is their kind of pre and post infrastructure with working with us. Large organizations wanting to take snapshots of this is what's in our workspace today. Where do we need to clean up and remove duplication, things like that, or also like take a screenshot essentially of your database structure in 2 months and say what properties have been added or what databases have been added, just from like a change management standpoint, and then also just educating around Notion structure and visualization of like, someone that doesn't understand databases and that, outside of Notion or even within Notion, and doesn't understand relationships between properties and rollups and things like that, being able to kind of abstract that into a more visual diagram. So this is the tool. This is the landing page. There's a demo there. If you click sign in, or if you're already signed in, it'll say go to app. And this is what it will look like. You probably won't have as many runs here. Everyone gets free credits, so you can just log in with your Notion account and you'll get free credits to try it out. You only get charged essentially credits if the process was successful. So if you do run into an issue, it's not like you're running through credits. So this is just sample. So this is a Notion page. This is just a template that I downloaded. It's got several different databases in here. If we click on one of them and look, you'll see that this has a relation. So if I open this up, you'll see that this is a specific database item, which is in posts, which is a database. And then there's a relation to social channel. So this is related to an item called blog, which is an item in the social channels database. And so what we'll do here is we'll just go back to this main page. So like you mentioned, if you have like a database page, you can use that. You don't want to use the database link itself. You want to use a page that basically contains the databases. And what the tool will do is it'll go and look at all these blocks. So it'll say this is a callout block. This is a linked view, denoted obviously here by the arrows. Whereas if it's an inline database, it won't have the arrow there. So that's another way that you can tell if they're linked views or if they're actual inline databases. And it'll go through all of these and pull out all the databases, and then it'll basically start looking at the different properties and how they're related. And it also works with rollups. So what we can do is you can use keyboard shortcuts to copy the link, or you can click up here and go to copy link, and there's the shortcut as well to copy it. And we'll go into the tool here and we'll paste it and we'll hit generate. And this is going to say that it's being generated, and it's going to take, some time for it to go off, since it has to scrape every single block essentially. So once it kicks off, if I refresh, it should show that it's running. So this is a prior example that I ran for a demo. So I'll click that one and open it up. And it gives you two things. So it gives you a visual representation. It also gives you this DBML, which essentially is a modeling language for databases that was created by the DB diagram team. And that's what the visualization is up here. So it's got specific syntax to essentially generate this visual. And this is an embed of the DB diagram. So just scrolling down to the bottom, you can see each one of these sections represents a table and their properties. The property has a property type. So these should be familiar: email, select, relation, title, which is essentially the primary key within Notion, date properties, formulas, etc. And then this is essentially the logic for all of the relations and or rollups. So it's basically saying this is a specific database with a specific property that is related to another database and a specific property. So you don't really need to know that and what all this means, but there is an ability here to click this copy button if you want to go paste this into dbdiagrams.io, which is right here, dbdiagram.io. And you can paste it in and get the same visual here. You can also interact with this visual specifically here in the embed. And if I drag this over and refresh, this is going to go back because it's just an embed that's essentially refreshing every time. So that's why I gave the option to take this and go and copy it. You can obviously create, additional properties and then save that in like a notepad or something. So if you have any ideas of other features, please do let me know. But going back to this, so we looked at the specific enhance your setup, which is in the post database, which was related to the social channels database. So I'm just going to zoom in here and we'll look for the post database, which is right here. So I'll just drag this one over and you'll see there's these two lines here. One is social channel. And then if I click on this line, it'll highlight and show me that it's related to social channels over here. So you can see here, there's essentially two different things. So in the social channels database, we have a relation to posts, which is essentially this line going to the posts side. And then we have in posts, we have a relation going to social channel, and these are both going to the ID. So what this is basically telling me is that this is a two-way relation. It's not a one-way relation. So that is how you can kind of denote that. And then you can see all of these other databases here have different properties where there's different relations and different rollups. And then also you can see here the formula. So this is just a rollup. But in the future, I'm going to be working to actually go get the formula logic. So that way, if the formula is using a relation from maybe multiple databases or essentially acting as a rollup, it will be able to graph that here as well. So that is the tool.
That's awesome. So one of my clients, we are preparing ourselves for a transition for them to own the Scratch OS workspace I built for them. And I mean, there are dozens of solutions in probably, 50 plus databases, I would think, across the entire workspace. I definitely need to use this, like trying to get them to understand what is underneath all of that over essentially like a year plus accumulation of builds. It'd be nearly impossible to get them to see it. And if they can't see it, then they're going to trip over and break things at a much higher rate. So thank you for building that. That is very valuable. And I would like to figure out, I want to include that in like my transition to support handoff package to all my clients. It's really good.
Yeah. So I guess my little shameless plug, it is a paid tool. Like I mentioned, there are some free credits, but there's different tiers. So I do have like a lifetime supporter tier, which is really geared at, people like us who are going to constantly be doing this, or like an organization that's constantly going to be taking snapshots. You can also just buy like a package of credits. So if you want to just test it out, that's also an option. And there's also a monthly subscription where you can just get refreshed credits every month, similar to Zapier and all of the other no-code automation tools. So the URL is notion-erd.com.
Excellent. Okay, well, we did it. I think we got a pretty comprehensive and clear picture. I'm going to get this Miro diagram kind of worked into a PDF that another SMB could use, or another Notion consultant. When I do that, I'll send it to you, and we can both use that as an artifact to share out with people as we see fit. So thanks for joining me on this, man. I appreciate it.
Absolutely.
Appreciate your time and your wisdom. And we'll let's go work on some clients together.
Cool. Thanks for having me, and always a pleasure to ideate and talk about Notion and other fun things. But yeah, I mean, the mathematical complexity and KPI stuff, that's really like the fun Notion things that I've been kind of more geared towards, is like solving complex problems. I mean, there's a lot of consultants, official or not official, or ambassadors or whatever. And that's, it's like taking the projects and tasks database as a template and like modifying it. I've done that enough that I don't want to continue to do it. It's these types of problems that other, consultants are just struggling with, and, even the ERD tool, that's where it would be a really cool future for me, is just to be able to continue to build tools and like do the kind of high touch, SME type stuff versus the, more comprehensive processes and things like that. So,
well, for some reason I like that part. So I think I'm gonna have plenty of work to throw your way. So
cool.
Yeah.
Sounds good.
Okay. Talk to you on the other side.
Yep. Thanks.